Welcome back as we explore the most intense hidden corners of history together. Today, I want to tell you a story not just about bombs or air battles, but about the value of things that are forgotten. In life, we sometimes feel like an obsolete item, pushed aside by a system that always demands perfection. But history has proven that it is the outcasts who change the game in the most spectacular ways. This is the story of Captain Jay Zemer, an old 666, a legend born from a scrap heap that went on to redefine courage in the skies of the Pacific. In the turbulent years of 1943 at the Port Moresby Air Base in New Guinea, the contrast between two worlds could not have been clearer. On one side was the symbol of American industrial might, with newly manufactured B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, their shiny aluminum skins reflecting the tropical sun engines running smoothly and crews in neat uniforms, always strictly adhering to every clause of military regulations. They were the faces of discipline, perfect war machines trained to fly in formations as beautiful as a military parade. But if you walked to the very edge of the airfield, where weeds grew taller than a man and the smell of mud overpowered the scent of aviation gasoline, you would find a completely different world. There, a B-17 with tail number 41-2666 lay silently like a wounded beast waiting to die. This aircraft, which the world would later know as Old 666, looked more like a pile of scrap metal than a piece of military hardware. It was covered in dust, with dark oil stains leaking from worn-out engines, and hundreds of holes from previous failed missions that had been patched up temporarily. To the commanding officers and regular aeronautical engineers, this plane was a burden, a piece of junk just waiting to be stripped for parts. No sane pilot wanted to sit in its cockpit, and people called it by the malicious name, the winged coffin. It represented everything obsolete, slow, and inferior in a war that demanded absolute precision. Yet it was in this aircraft graveyard that Jay Zemer found a strange kinship. Zemer was not the model soldier the US Army desired. He was a born rebel, a man who frequently fell asleep during briefings and wore his uniform as if he had just stepped off a battlefield. In a system that valued obedience, Zemer was seen as a misfit, a talented but uncontrollable pilot. He had moved through many units, but nowhere would accept a man who refused to fly in formation and always wanted to do things his own way. When Zemer stood before Old 666, the contrast between him and the rest of the military became clearer than ever. He didn't see a broken plane, he saw himself in it rejected and looked down upon, yet still harboring immense potential, while other pilots were preoccupied with brand new planes and standard training. Zemer and his team, who were also considered the rejects of the squadron, began spending hours with the scrap pile that was Old 666. The usefulness this story brings to us today is a lesson in vision. The value of an object or a person does not lie in their appearance or the evaluation of the majority, but in who uses them and for what purpose. Zemer understood that to survive the loneliest and most dangerous missions, he didn't need a beautiful plane. He needed a plane that could fight his way. The meeting between a rejected pilot and an abandoned plane at the corner of that New Guinea airfield was the beginning of one of the most brilliant chapters in aerial warfare history, where forgotten values would rise to strike back at the system's fake perfection. In the world of the regular military, every change had to be accompanied by stacks of paperwork, approval signatures from superiors, and rigorous assessments by aeronautical engineers. But for Jay Zemer and his eager beavers crew, time was something they didn't have, and permission was something they knew they would never receive. The contrast here lay in the confrontation between the conservative, rigid mindset of the system and the flexible, daring nature of practical minds. When the chief engineers looked at Old 666 and shook their heads in resignation, believing it was too heavy, too slow, and no longer capable of combat by standard measures, Zemer saw a massive steel frame that could be turned into a true flying fortress. He realized that the fatal weakness of the B-17 series lay in the nose, which the Japanese frequently exploited for head-on attacks without fear of retaliation. Therefore, Zemer decided to break all original design rules. This hacking took place in the shadows of sleepless nights in New Guinea, under the dim light of flashlights and the piercing sound of steel welders. Zemer did not go asking for new weapons from the ordnance depot, because he knew he would be rejected immediately. Instead, he and his crew scouted through scrapyards, dismantling .50 caliber machine guns from the wrecks of downed P-38 fighters. They scavenged every meter of ammunition belts and every mounting bracket from the ruins of the battlefield to install onto Old 666. These grease-stained American soldiers personally drilled new holes into the aircraft's aluminum skin. They were no longer ordinary pilots and gunners. They had become spontaneous field engineers, restructuring their survival tool through self-belief. The core value this period brings is the understanding of bottom-up innovation. In any organization, those who directly face the risks are often the ones who see the best solutions. Zimmer performed a crazy modification himself. He mounted a heavy machine gun directly under the cockpit floor, between his own legs, and rigged cables so he could fire it. A 4-engine bomber was now transformed into a massive combat machine. It possessed the targeting capability of a flexible fighter. When the regular engineers saw this Frankenstein monster with a total of 19 machine guns, they mocked it and called it a suicidal experiment. They believed old 666 would never be able to take off safely. The contrast here was not just about machinery but about life philosophy. The system believed in proven safety, while Zimmer believed in firepower and over-preparedness beyond necessity. He didn't need the fastest plane. He needed the thorniest plane to survive and return from a mission where the survival rate was near zero. Amassing ammunition and machine guns beyond authorized limits was their way of reclaiming control over their own destiny. Every bullet and every weld was a statement of survival. When the modifications were complete, old 666 stood there, heavy, rugged, and menacing. It was the complete opposite of its lighter, weaker counterparts. For the Eager Beaver's crew, this plane was a part of their bodies, a Frankenstein monster stitched together by the tenacity of those who had nothing left to lose. The former scrap heap now carried a latent, destructive power waiting for the moment to overturn every enemy calculation in the Solomon skies. The Pacific sky on a June morning in 1943 was a haunting contrast between poetic natural beauty and the brutality of war. While standard American bomber squadrons usually took off under the heavy protection of dozens of escort fighters, forming an impenetrable block of steel in the air, all 666 trudged into enemy territory in absolute solitude. The contrast here was not just in numbers, but in the sense of presence. On one side was carefully calculated collective strength, on the other, the unilateral daring of a group of men with no way back. As Zimmer's heavy bomber left the runway, it did not carry the glamour of a glorious mission. It carried the breath of a suicide mission. Old 666 was now like a lone whale swimming upstream into shark-infested waters, where every Japanese radar and anti-aircraft battery on Bougainville Island was ready to crush it. The photographic reconnaissance mission demanded a sacrifice few pilots would accept. The plane had to maintain a perfectly straight flight path without swerving or changing altitude for the entire duration the cameras were running. This created an ironic contrast. To obtain the precise maps that would save thousands of Marines on the ground, those in the air had to turn themselves into a fixed target, a sitting duck in the middle of a crossfire. While the sea below was deep blue and peaceful, inside the cockpit of old 666 was extreme tension. The old engines roared in protest against the weight of 19 machine guns and thousands of extra rounds of ammunition. Every vibration of the fuselage was a reminder of the fragility of the aluminum skin against the enemy's 20mm cannons. Zimmer looked out the misty window. He saw no sign of any escorting comrades, only endless clouds and the bone-chilling cold of 25,000 feet. The appearance of the enemy created a tactical turning point of contrast. On the horizon, 17 Japanese Zero fighters emerged like a swarm of angry hornets. These Zeros were the elite of the Imperial Air Force, piloted by seasoned veterans who viewed taking down a lone bomber as an easy target practice. The contrast between the two types of hardware was immense. On one side were light, agile fighters that could maneuver and attack from any angle. On the other was the bulky, heavy flying fortress struggling to maintain balance. To the Japanese pilots, old 666 looked like an exhausted old beast. They had no idea they were charging into a death trap disguised as a scrap pile. The hunter's overconfidence stood in total opposition to the prey's silent and fierce preparation. The profound value we can draw from this context is the power of focus in adversity. When facing odds of 1 against 17, most people would choose to flee or give up. But Zimmer and his crew turned their solitude into a psychological advantage. They no longer had to worry about maintaining formation or coordinating with anyone else. They only had each other and this plane. The contrast between the vast expanse of the sky and the cramped weapon-filled space inside old 666 created a sense of an unshakable spiritual fortress. In the nose compartment, Joe Sarnowski double-checked the machine guns he had personally installed. His calm gaze contrasted with the chaos that was about to break loose. They knew this was no longer an ordinary battle, but a confrontation between overwhelming numbers and the quality of individual will. This chapter ends with the image of Old 6, 6-6, entering the enemy's encirclement. The first machine gun fire rang out, shattering the silence of the stratosphere, marking the beginning of the most horrific 40 minutes in aerial warfare history. The final contrast here was the stillness of the reconnaissance mission, the silent photography versus the explosion of a survival battle. Zimmer gripped the controls, his eyes burning with a terrifyingly resolute look. He was no longer the rebellious pilot who slept during briefings. He had become the soul of the aircraft, ready to prove to the world that a Frankenstein monster, when controlled by those who know no fear, can do things that a regular army wouldn't even dare to dream of. As the swarm of Zero fighters began their dive, the Pacific sky exploded in a display of brutal contrast between artistic technique and raw power. The Japanese pilots, trained to perform precise maneuvers like artists, dove in with absolute confidence in every decisive strike. In their minds, this lone B-17 was just a stranded whale in the sky, and they were the butchers preparing to carve it up without hesitation. They split into groups, attacking from the 12 o'clock position, targeting the fragile glass nose they believed was protected only by a single weak light machine gun. The contrast here was staggering: 17 sleek fighters, agile as sharp blades, versus one old heavy bomber. The plane was roaring in its engine's death throes, but when the lead Zero entered the sights, the script the Japanese had expected was completely torn apart. Instead of seeing a panicked American pilot swerving to expose the plane's belly, they faced an unbelievable wall of fire spitting directly at them. The moment Zimmer pressed the button to trigger the fixed machine gun between his legs, and Sarnowski fired the two heavy machine guns in the nose, Old 666 was no longer a bomber. It turned into a giant chainsaw slicing through the sky, where 50 caliber bullets as big as thumbs zoomed out at extreme velocity. The violent contrast was evident between this massive stream of fire and the smaller 20mm cannon burst from the Japanese charging from the front. The lead Zero, a masterpiece of lightweight and agility, evaporated instantly in a brilliant orange fireball. The stream of fire from Old 666's nose tore it apart in an instant, turning the hunters' confidence into sheer terror. They realized they weren't attacking a sitting duck, but were charging headlong into a steel porcupine, launching lethal quills from every angle. The new value we see here is the changing definition of strength. It is not always the faster one who wins, but the one who is better prepared. The contrast between Japan's sophisticated attack tactics and Zimmer's Frankenstein defensive firepower created a chaotic battlefield beyond all initial calculations. Inside the plane, the sound was no longer isolated explosions, but a continuous ear-piercing roar of 19 machine guns firing at once. The fuselage shook so violently, it felt as if the crew's tooth fillings were about to fall out, in total contrast to the deathly silence of the space outside. The thick smell of gunpowder and gray smoke filled the cockpit, blurring the vision, but igniting the survival will of the soldiers on Old 666. They were no longer firing according to textbook rhythms. They held the triggers tight, turning the space around the plane into an absolute kill zone. The physical contrast also reached its peak in this chapter, as the fragile Zeros built to optimize speed had almost no protective armor. Conversely, Zimmer's Old 666 was a heavy block of steel full of patched-up bullet shields and extra machine guns that increased the weight to alarming levels. As the Japanese bullets pierced Old 666's aluminum skin, they only created holes but could not collapse the will of this monster. Every downed Zero falling into the sea like a burning meteor created a tragic contrast against the deep blue backdrop of the ocean. Meanwhile, Old 666 trudged forward, bleeding through hundreds of bullet holes but refusing to yield to the immense pressure. It was like an old heavyweight boxer enduring countless punches, just waiting for a chance to deliver the final decisive blow. By the end of this chapter, the sky around Bougainville was no longer a peaceful blue, but had been shredded by tracer streaks and black smoke. The final contrast lay in the status of the two sides. 17 hunters were now struggling to find a way to survive against a lone prey. Jay Zimmer, with sweat pouring down his face and eyes intensely focused, was maneuvering the bomber like a true fighter jet. He no longer cared about the aviation theories the experts had taught. He only cared about keeping his monster roaring. This chainsaw battle proved that in a life-or-death moment, daring creativity and overwhelming firepower can overturn every rule of war. It turned a seemingly useless pile of scrap into an immortal legend, carving its mark deep into the burning Pacific sky. In the heart of the battle's storm, the contrast between the high purpose of the mission and the shattered reality became clearer than ever. As the reconnaissance camera beneath the fuselage began to operate, it demanded absolute stillness. A straight flight path lasting 10 minutes in the midst of the enemy's encirclement. This was a painful paradox. While Zemer struggled to keep Old 666 steady as a rock in a rushing current, the Japanese threw everything they had into turning it into a pile of aluminum scraps. The contrast here was between the steady, mechanical sound of the camera, shutter, click click, and the frenzied roar of 20mm cannon shells tearing through the plane's skin. Every passing second was a gamble with life. A place where courage was no longer an abstract concept, but the ability to endure pain to get the job done. The most dramatic contrast occurred in the nose compartment where Joe Sarnowski stood firm at his station. A Japanese cannon shell pierced the plexiglass, exploding right inside the compartment, knocking Sarnowski backward. Blood began to pour out, staining his flight suit and the cold floor of the plane red, creating a horrific contrast with the brilliant sunlight outside. While his body was sending its final distress signals, his will ordered him to crawl back up. The image of Sarnowski, with hands trembling from blood loss, struggling to grasp the handles of his 2 heavy machine guns, is an absolute symbol of devotion. He didn't choose to hide from the pain or seek help. He chose to protect his brothers until his final breath. This sacrifice was not just a simple heroic act. It was the contrast between the finitude of the human body and the infinitude of the spirit of responsibility. Inside the cockpit, Jay Zemer was experiencing a similar hell. A bullet went through his left leg, shattering the bone and tearing the muscle, while another lodged in his wrist. The contrast between the extreme physical pain, a sensation like a red-hot iron bar piercing the nervous system, and the mandatory alertness to control a 20-ton machine was an indescribable torture. Zemer looked down at his leg where blood had formed a slippery puddle on the cockpit floor, in total opposition to the indicators dancing wildly on the shattered instrument panel. He had 2 clear choices: either dip the nose of the plane to flee into the clouds below to save his own life, or keep the wings level for a few more minutes so the precious film could be completed. Zemer's choice redefined the value of a commander he chose: pain in exchange for the mission's success. The new value this story brings us lies in the concept of the cost of truth. The photographs that Zemer and Sarnowski were protecting were not just pieces of film. They were life maps for thousands of American Marines in the upcoming campaign. The contrast between 10 minutes of endurance by one crew and the lives of an entire army was a deeply humane calculation. When the oxygen system was shot to pieces and the thin air at 25,000 feet made everything blurry, Zemer had to fight the darkness closing in on his vision. He could no longer see the enemy or the clouds. He saw only one goal: 10 minutes. The stillness of the photography mission now contrasted with the chaos of blood and steel, creating a sacred moment where humans transcended all physical limits to reach the heights of ultimate sacrifice. At the end of this chapter, as the camera counter finally hit 0, Sarnowski collapsed beside his machine guns for the last time. He had completed his mission of protecting the nose of Old 666, trading his life to keep the heart of the plane from being pierced. The final contrast here was the silence of death alongside the continued roar of the engines. Zemer, his face pale from blood loss, knew his best friend was gone, but he could not let go of the controls. The photography mission was over, but the mission to bring the rest of them home had just begun. Old 666, now shredded like an aluminum net, began to leave the kill zone, carrying the precious photos, and the soul of a fallen hero, leaving behind a sky burning with smoke and the dark streaks of an unforgettable sacrifice. The Pacific sky after the battle became hauntingly silent, creating a painful contrast with the firestorm that had just ended. Old 666 no longer looked like a majestic bomber. Instead, it looked like an aluminum ghost drifting through the air. The contrast here lay in the opposition between the abundant mechanical power at takeoff and the total exhaustion upon return. The fuselage was riddled with hundreds of holes, and hydraulic lines were severed, causing red oil to spill out like blood from wounded arteries. Inside the cockpit, Jay Zemer was fighting another battle. It was a battle against his own fading consciousness. The contrast between hands trembling from blood loss and the requirement to hold the controls with extreme precision was a challenge beyond human limits. He could no longer feel his left leg. It had become a numb block of pain in total contrast to the cold air rushing in through the holes in the windshield. The 600-mile journey back to base was a prolonged torture of time, while other planes in the squadron usually returned in jubilation and were met by rescue teams. Old 666 flew back in the hopeless silence of a shattered radio system. The contrast between the vast blue expanse of the ocean below and the cramped space inside the plane, filled with the scent of death, created a sense of ultimate loneliness. Zemer had to use his right hand to grip the yoke and his last bit of strength in his right leg to control the rudder, while his entire body screamed to be allowed to pass out. The new value we learn here is the power of silent tenacity. Sometimes, Keeping something from falling apart is much harder than attacking the enemy. Every mile flown was a victory of will over the laws of physics that were trying to pull the plane down to the ocean floor. As the New Guinea coast appeared on the horizon, the contrast between hope and the harsh reality flared up once again. WWII base appeared as a safe haven, but for Zimmer, landing a 20-ton bomber without brakes and without a hydraulic system, with only one functioning limb, was an impossible mission. The contrast between the image of the solid ground approaching and the swaying, out-of-control movement of the plane created a touch-and-go situation. Zimmer looked down at the dusty dirt runway where ambulances were already waiting, looking small and helpless, before the monster descending from the sky. He knew that just one small mistake, one bounce too hard, and old 666 would break apart, taking the lives of his remaining brothers who lay in pain in the rear compartment. The moment the wheels touched the ground was an explosion of final physical contrasts. The screech of tires on the dry earth contrasted with the breathless silence of the crew inside. The plane had no brakes, so it continued to charge forward, like an out-of-control wild horse running the full length of the runway and crashing into the grass with dust billowing to obscure the view. When old Bolt 666 came to a complete stop with the groan of twisting metal silence enveloped the space, the contrast between the frenetic chaos of the air battle and the absolute stillness of the plane, once stopped, created an indescribable sense of tragedy. Rescue teams rushed in, stunned to see a plane so literally shredded that it could still bring men home. This chapter ends with the image of Jay Zimmer slumping his head over the controls as medical personnel pried his hands away. He had kept his soul alert long enough to perform the life-saving landing for everyone. The contrast between his pale, lifeless face and the intact reconnaissance film rolls in the camera bay was the answer to all their crazy efforts. Old 666 had completed its final mission, like a ghost returning from the dead to deliver the enemy's secrets, a testament that no matter how damaged a machine is, it can still fly if the one controlling it has a heart that never knows how to give up. As the sun set over the WWII runway, the silence surrounding the wreck of Old 666 created a tragic contrast with the bustling noise of the base at that time. Aeronautical engineers who once laughed at Zimmer's Frankenstein design now stood stunned before an unbelievable sight. The contrast here lay in the opposition between rigid technical theories and the brutal reality of the battlefield. They counted a total of 187 holes in the fuselage. The wing, the backbone of this monster, had a partially severed main spar. According to every law of physics, it should have fallen off the fuselage in the skies over Bougainville, but it was still there, rugged and shredded, proving a truth that when human will is strong enough, they can command metal to obey. The legacy of this battle does not lie in metals, but in a shift in mindset. The contrast between the weak nose of the standard B-17 and the birth of the later B-17G series, with its modern chin turret, was the most definitive answer to Zimmer's correctness. The US military had to admit that the rebellious pilot they once wanted to get rid of was the one who saw the flaw that thousands of white-coated engineers had overlooked. Jay Zimmer and Joe Sarnowski both received the Medal of Honor, a rare contrast in history, where two members of the same crew received the highest honor for the same mission. But for Zimmer, who had to spend a year in the hospital fighting to keep his leg from being amputated, the greatest contrast was being alive to retell the story of his fallen best friend. He never considered himself a hero. He only considered himself lucky to have controlled a monster with a soul. Old 666 did not survive the war to become a museum artifact. It was dismantled, melted down, and recycled into ordinary items. The contrast between a great warship in the sky and the pots and pans in the kitchens of American families after the war carries a profound philosophical beauty. Its metal may have vanished, but the spirit of the outcasts has merged into the blood of American innovation and courage. This story leaves a useful value for us today. Never underestimate what is considered scrap, and never let a rigid system extinguish your creative fire. The reconnaissance photos that the crew traded their blood for saved thousands of lives, and that is the most eternal monument. Thank you for spending time with us through this extraordinary journey of Old 666 and the Eager Beavers crew. This is proof that courage does not need a shiny coat of paint to shine. If you love stories about silent heroes and dramatic historical turning points like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next videos. Your support is the motivation for us to continue searching for and retelling forgotten golden pages of history. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below about whether you think Zimmer was a genius or a madman. Goodbye, and see you in our upcoming journeys.